Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from Jumpstart, Emiel the Blessed. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. For as little as $1, patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, while higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to both of them down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Emiel is a 4/4 unicorn for 2 generic and 2 white, already passing the vanilla test. On top of that, it has an activated ability and a triggered ability. For 3 mana, you can blink a creature you control. In and of itself, this is an amazing ability in the command zone. Just look at Rune of the Hidden Realm. However, unlike Rune, Emiel doesn't have to tap to do so and is much cheaper to activate. The only sacrifice for this is losing access to blue. In any case, it's a busted ability with the amount of abilities this can trigger. Its triggered ability complements it by letting you put a +1/+1 counter on that creature if you paid a green-white hybrid mana when a creature enters the battlefield under your control. If the creature is a unicorn, then you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead. While this might steer players to build a unicorn tribal deck with Emiel, I went for a straightforward enter the battlefield matters blinking deck to make the most of its first ability. That being said, if there's enough mana left over, you can definitely use it to pump your creatures with its second ability. But of the two, the best one to build around is the first one, for me at least. As far as blinking goes, the only advantage Emiel has is being in the command zone. It's not the only source for blinking in the deck. Eldrazi Displacer does the same thing, and some might argue is better since it can also target opponents' creatures. However, the Displacer requires colorless mana as part of its cost, where Emiel is purely generic mana. That being said, Eldrazi Displacer is still great redundancy in the deck. Just keep in mind that whatever you blink returns to the battlefield tapped. That's a pro against opponents but a con against you. Conjurer's Closet can be activated like Emiel and Eldrazi Displacer, but at least it's a good way to trigger another enter the battlefield effect at the end of your turn for free. This can definitely help in duplicating key enter the battlefield effects. As for doubling enter the battlefield effects, Panharmonicon is a no-brainer in this deck. Most of the creatures in the deck have amazing enter the battlefield effects, so being able to copy each one for free when they enter the battlefield is pretty busted. Especially when blinking them since you get that effect 2 more times. Illusionist Bracers is another way to achieve this. Whether equipped to Emiel or Eldrazi Displacer, this allows you to copy their activated ability, meaning that for just 3 mana you can blink a creature twice. It should be quite evident how grossly busted this becomes while having something like Panharmonicon on the battlefield, or even with having Bramble Sovereign on the battlefield. Every time we blink something, we can activate Bramble Sovereign to not only get a copy of that creature each time, but that copy token will also trigger their enter the battlefield effect, essentially duplicating it as well. So not only can you multiply effects but also amass quite the army. While this might seem quite the investment in mana, Hearthstone reduces the cost of these activated abilities by 1 generic mana. That being said, there are 2 more creatures in the deck that benefit from it, but we'll see them later. Since the deck can be quite mana hungry, Hearthstone isn't the only solution to this. First, let's see how we can take advantage of Emiel in accelerating the deck mana-wise, and then how we can sink all of that mana on epic plays and the engines in the deck. First off, we need an early Emiel to make the most of the effects in the deck. Birds of Paradise, Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, Finhorn Elves, Avacyn's Pilgrim, and Boreal Druid are great 1-drops to cast early on. Not only that, but they can also be used to trigger other effects that we're going to see later on. Clearly the best one is Birds of Paradise. Boreal Druid tends to be a bad include in decks as a mana dork, especially when there are so many better choices and having too many is not a good thing. But it does provide colorless mana to activate Eldrazi Displacer, and Emiel uses generic mana, so it can pay for it as well. So while it's limited to being super helpful in casting spells, it can still help with generic cost as well as colorless cost. It's also a body which, as I mentioned earlier, is key for the deck. Dryad Arbor is also in the deck for that same reason. It might be a fragile land because it can die, but having a body is a benefit in this deck. Being a forest also means that it can be ramped for, which is amazing as well. Speaking of being ramped for, the deck is running Farhaven Elf, Solemn Simulacrum, Core Cartographer, and Wood Elves. While the first 2 ramp for a basic land when they enter the battlefield, the latter 2 are actually much better since they can fetch for lands with the basic land type, meaning they can tutor for any of the dual type lands in the deck as well as lands like Dryad Arbor and the others included here. Blinking these creatures is definitely a great way to continue getting ahead in mana. Notwithstanding, you know I have to include Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits. These might not be on a body like the previously mentioned creatures, but they are cheaper to cast and can also get any dual type land onto the battlefield. Again, still waiting for 3 Visits to be reprinted since it's now a $100 common that isn't on the reserve list. There's no reason Nature's Lore has been repeated 8 times, and 3 Visits is a functional reprint of it, which has only ever been printed once. 3 Visits should also be reprinted as often, but that's a subject for another day. Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are included in order to diversify our mana sources. Again, these are amazing here to not only get ahead in the early game, but to make it easier to activate our blink effects. We can also make the most of our mana with Seedborn Muse and Wilderness Reclamation. While the enchantment is limited only to our end step, we can still use it to tap out during our turn without worrying about it, because then we'll have the mana open for our responses or to keep activating our abilities. Seedborn Muse is obviously the GOAT here, since we can untap all of our permanents each untap step. So it's incredibly obvious how that's borderline broken in a deck like this one. We can get similar effects with Village Bell Ringer and Patron of the Orochi. Remember how I mentioned the importance of having bodies in this deck? From Birds of Paradise to Dryad Arbor, those creatures are green, so activating Patron of the Orochi will untap them along with every green creature and forest we have, including itself. Even though this is limited to once each turn, we can still do a lot each turn in terms of activating abilities thanks to it. Village Bell Ringer is not limited to that though. If the mana we get from our mana dorks is enough to blink it and then have some left over, blinking Village Bell Ringer can provide us with infinite mana. That infinite mana can then be used to blink as many of our creatures as we want, which fuels most of the win cons in the deck. Not to say that those win cons are only possible with infinite mana, but infinite mana almost guarantees us the victory with them. Workhorse is another way to get infinite mana, but requires a bit of work to achieve that. At least on its own, Workhorse provides infinite enter the battlefield triggers. Since it enters with 4 +1/+1 counters as its default, you can use these to pay for either Emiel or a Eldrazi Displacer, since it'll be a 1/1 afterwards, and not die as a state-based action. However, with the previously mentioned Hearthstone, since it reduces Emiel's activated ability by 1, you only need to remove 2 +1/+1 counters from Workhorse to activate Emiel. That means the third counter can be used to add to your mana pool before blinking it. This provides infinite colorless mana. So, as with the previously mentioned examples, this is another infinite mana engine that can activate Emiel infinitely many times. The deck does include other conventional methods of getting lots of mana, like Smothering Tithe and Growing Rites of Itlimoc. Smothering Tithe is yet another way to diversify our mana base, since it's an enchantment which is harder to get rid of than creatures and artifacts. Most of the time, opponents won't pay the 2, so you get a free treasure, sometimes 3 in a turn. Growing Rites of Itlimoc is useful when it enters the battlefield, since we can get a creature from the top 4 cards of our library, but we want it in the deck mostly because it transforms into Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun, which is an upgraded Gaia's Cradle. With so many creatures we'll have on the battlefield, the amount of mana this generates is insane. Alright, so now that we have all this mana, we need to invest it somewhere, right? Well, first let's make sure we don't run out of steam and are able to keep filling our hand with responses and the actual meat of the deck. Wall of Omens, Wall of Blossoms, Elvish Visionary, and Llanowar Visionary each cantrip when they enter the battlefield. Llanowar Emissary has the added bonus of tapping for green mana, justifying why it costs a bit more. On their own, they simply replace themselves. However, having bodies is key for the engines of the deck, but also to get blinked with Emiel. Whenever we're running low on cards, 3 mana will draw us another card. Even so, the Great Henge, Guardian Project, and Soul of the Harvest are even better engines for drawing cards, since they make each non-token creature enter the battlefield cantrip. The Great Henge has the added bonus of tapping for green mana while also gaining us 2 life in the process. It also puts a +1/+1 counter on that non-token creature entering the battlefield. Remember Workhorse? This is another way to make it go infinite with Emiel. With all of these card draw engines, Reliquary Tower is a great inclusion in the deck. Not only does it not take up a slot since it's a land, but being 2 colors means we can run it without that higher risk of getting color screwed. Either way, the colorless mana is great for the Eldrazi Displacer. Woodland Bellower is another great way to get card advantage. Not necessarily in the same sense of drawing cards, but when it enters the battlefield, it can cheat in any cheap green creature from our deck onto the battlefield. This can be any mana dork or cantripper or other tool or piece we need, like Eternal Witness. Similarly, not card advantage in the sense of strict card draw, but it is able to recover any card from the graveyard when it enters the battlefield. Being able to continuously blink Eternal Witness can provide immeasurable advantage, same with the Bellower. Taking it a step further, Sun Titan can reanimate that cheap permanent right onto the battlefield when it enters the battlefield and attacks. Being a 6/6 with Vigilance for just 6 mana doesn't hurt either. The versatility can range anywhere from recovering small creatures to any of the 8 fetch lands in the deck. We can also bottom deck things from our graveyard with Mistveil Plains. Having them at the bottom of the library might seem worse than having them in the graveyard, but this can be done in response to having them exiled from the graveyard. Either way, having the Plains subtype makes it easy to fetch, and the library is shuffled quite often with this deck, so those cards aren't really doomed to stay at the bottom of the library. As I mentioned earlier, the reason we need mana is to power the deck and its many engines, one of those being drawing through the deck for responses and what we'll be using to win. First off, we need to protect Emiel and or Eldrazi Displacer, since they are the main force behind the deck. Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots are a must. The reason we have to protect them from targeted effects is because they can't target themselves with their own ability, since it says another target creature. That being said, if they're both on the battlefield, you can target one with the other in response to a targeted effect. In the meantime, we have the footwear. Shalai, Voice of Prendy, does something similar but with all of our creatures, and for us too. Unfortunately, Shalai doesn't give herself hexproof. Equipping her with the boots fixes that though. Also, Shalai is one of those creatures I was referring to when I talked about Hearthstone. She's one of the win cons of the deck as well. We can empty infinite mana into her to make our army have infinitely many +1/+1 counters on them. She does need double green for that, which means that the workhorse combo isn't enough to power her, but we can still pull it off with the village bellringer combo. Either way, if we can't go entirely infinite with green mana, we can sink as much green mana into her with the infinite colorless mana and potentially get an army big enough to win the game even if they're not infinitely powerful. So not only is Shalai a great way to protect ourselves and our creatures, but she can also help in the deck aggroing out. Speaking of aggroing out, Cathar's Crusade does something similar. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, all of our creatures, including that same creature, get a +1/+1 counter. Again, this is the importance of all the bodies in the deck. Not only that, but it triggers when tokens enter the battlefield too. Although the workhorse combo by itself isn't enough to get infinite +1/+1 counters with Shalai, it is enough with Cathar's Crusade since it's entering the battlefield infinitely many times, thus making the rest of our army get infinitely many +1/+1 counters. On top of that, since the Crusade gives the workhorse an extra +1/+1 counter whenever it enters the battlefield, like we saw before, this lets us generate infinite colorless mana since the workhorse will have 5 +1/+1 counters when it enters the battlefield. Some more things for aggroing out. Armada Worm is included to create quite the army. Getting 10 power with Trample on the board for just 6 mana is ridiculous enough, but being able to then blink it to get another 5/5 Trampler is just epic. Even more so if we copy the Armada Worm itself with Bramble Sovereign. We get 2 more 5/5 Tramplers for that. Similarly, Thragtusk can create an army of tokens. Granted, it's when it leaves the battlefield, but that's what happens when we blink things anyways. As a bonus, it gains us 5 life whenever it enters the battlefield. So not only does blinking it add 8 power to the board, but we also get 5 life for our trouble. This is great for when we become the arch enemy and get attacked by the rest of the table. Trostani Celestian's Voice does something similar but with all of our creatures entering the battlefield. You can also activate her to populate, thus copying any other token on the battlefield. So Trostani basically synergizes with not only the blinking aspect of the deck, but the token creating aspect of it as well. Her activated ability even costs 1 less thanks to Hearthstone. Blessed Sanctuary is another way to create a ton of tokens. Not only do we get a free 2/2 whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, but as a bonus, this enchantment protects our creatures from non-combat damage, laughing in the face of cards like Blasphemous Act. It also protects us from non-combat damage for even further bonuses. The rest of the cards we want to be digging for are our answers. By this point, it should be obvious that most of the responses and answers in the deck are stapled onto bodies, which can then be abused by the engines in the deck. Although Eldrazi Displacer can blink any attackers coming our way or potential blockers to have them return tapped, some creatures just need to be outright gotten rid of. Duplicant, Mangara of Corondor, and Fiend Hunter take it a step further by permanently exiling that creature. While Duplicant can do so in a straightforward way, Mangara and Fiend Hunter need to be blinked in order to do so. First, let's look at Mangara. Mangara exiles itself along with the creature it's exiling. However, if we respond to Mangara's effect by blinking him, when he returns he's a different instance of Mangara. That means that when his ability resolves, it'll exile the target but not the new Mangara, since the Mangara affected by the ability is no longer around. Fiend Hunter can do the same thing, but it is a little different. Let's see how that works. Fiend Hunter has 2 different triggers, one when it enters the battlefield and another when it leaves the battlefield. What you want to do is blink Fiend Hunter in response to its enter the battlefield triggered ability entering the stack. Since it's being exiled to the blink effect, its leaves the battlefield ability triggers. However, since its enter the battlefield trigger hasn't resolved yet, there isn't anything exiled with it yet, so nothing returns to the battlefield from exile. However, once that resolves, its first ability resolves, exiling the target creature. Since its leave the battlefield effect already happened, if it were to leave the battlefield again for whatever reason, that creature it exiled will not return to the battlefield from exile, essentially staying there. If you want to see these kinds of interactions explained in greater detail, check out my video in the link above explaining Oubliette's massive functional errata with its double Master's Reprint, and then head on back for the rest of this video. While these creatures just mentioned are great at exiling any creature, commanders can still present a problem. This is why Song of the Dryads and Darksteel Mutation are included in the deck. Unless the player gets rid of the enchantment somehow, apart from sacrifice effects, it's going to be very difficult to get their commander back. However, if our opponent's board states are just too overwhelming to deal with one at a time, casting Wrath of God or Hour of Revelation will get the job done. Yes, this will also wipe our own board, but if we're behind in the game, it's quite the equalizer. Either way, we can also use these offensively if we're able to protect our own board state. Flawless Maneuver and Heroic Intervention do the trick. The former only makes our creatures indestructible, so keep that in mind. Either way, these are also great to cast in response to any of our opponent's own wiping the board themselves. Even then, these aren't the only responses to board wipes in the deck. Eerie Interlude, Ghostway, and Teferi's Protection take our creatures out of harm's way altogether. Not only that, but the first two can also be used offensively since they delay blink all of our creatures. That means that when they all return, we'll get an insane amount of enter the battlefield triggers for some epic interactions. Teferi's Protection is actually the best of them all since it just phases out ourselves and everything we have. This means that we don't lose tokens or life or anything really. Finally, Luminous Broodmoth doesn't protect our creatures from a board wipe per se, but at least any creatures that don't fly will return to the battlefield afterwards with a flying counter on it. That actually makes our creatures better since they'll have relevant evasion. Even then, if we don't want the creature to have the flying counter, we can just blink it to get rid of it. Besides getting rid of our opponent's creatures, we can just make it so that none of them can attack with Stonehorn Dignitary. Blinking it thrice is enough to deprive our opponents of being able to attack us, let alone anyone else. This might delay the game a bit, so keep that in mind. However, if we have the advantage, then taking away combat allows us to attack with all of our creatures and not have to worry about being defenseless afterwards. As for dealing with other threats, Terrastodon can deal with anything that isn't a creature. Sure, our opponents get a 3/3 elephant for their trouble, but that's moot if they can't attack us with it or if all of our creatures are way larger than it. We can also just blink them away with Eldrazi Displacer. If you want to be especially evil, blink Terrastodon enough times to destroy all of our opponents' lands, giving them elephants for their trouble. Elephants that won't really be able to do anything to us or about us. Same goes with Beasts Within and Generous Gift. These, however, can get rid of any permanent and instant speed, giving opponents a useless 3/3 as compensation. Even though we can blink things at instant speed, if we don't have ways to do so, these instants are total lifesavers. Acidic Slime can also get rid of multiple types of problems, although not expansively as the previously mentioned effects. That being said, it's also a 2/2 with Death Touch, so it's also a good jump blocker, although it's better used to blink multiple times. Again, if you want to be especially evil, get rid of your opponent's lands with it. Aura Shards takes it a step further by making all of your creatures destroy an artifact or enchantment when they enter the battlefield. They don't destroy a land like the slime can, but at least you can make it so that opponents don't have any kind of artifact or enchantment on the battlefield whatsoever. Finally, Angel of Finality makes it so any Graveyard Matters or Reanimation decks roll in a fetal position and sob silently. Every time these types of decks get too happy with their graveyards, blink it once again to exile them. This might be a meta call for some, and that's okay. If that's the case, you can swap it out for Whip Streeper. This helps in recovering anything you have exiled and make it go to your graveyard. You can then use Eternal Witness to get them back from the graveyard. This should be a simple enough swap. The rest of the deck is just the lands. The deck's running all 8 fetch lands: Savannah, Temple Garden, Canopy Vista, Scattered Groves, Command Tower, Bountiful Promenade, Ancient Tomb, Temple of the False God, as well as 7 of each snow-covered land in case opponents are running anything that benefits us for it. The reason for so many basic lands is because we ramp so much with this deck that it's best to always have something to search for. It's also a 2-colored deck, so getting color screwed doesn't have such a high likelihood. As for Savannah, as I mentioned in my deck tech videos, if you don't already have it or can't afford it or aren't playing online, no worries. It's not crucial for the deck to run. You could just swap it out for Brushland. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Emiel the Blessed. Not only is this deck incredibly powerful, but it's also a lot of fun to play. It's not the complicated deck to pilot, even though it has a lot of engines and synergies. You can also play this as casually or cruelly as you like, given that you can very easily wipe your opponent's fields of their lands. So Emiel is as benevolent as you'd want it to be. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.